Independence Day celebrations tend to be marked with joyous parades and fireworks. That's not the case for South Sudan. Ongoing conflict, famine, and a mass exodus of civilians are the reasons the government says it won't be holding any public ceremonies. About a third of the country's population of 12.5 million have been forced to flee their homes because of the ongoing civil war and deteriorating living conditions. Who's to blame? Well, a new report by Amnesty International says both government forces and rebel militias have been involved in the torture and killing of civilians. And the UN says the country is potentially facing genocide. Well, joining me now from London is Marwan Mortat. He's a South Sudan political commentator and analyst. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. 6 years on, is there anything to celebrate?
Not really. I mean, you've described it very well. The war has affected the country severely. And also, the government has no money, really, to even conduct a small-scale celebration.
If you can pinpoint one moment when it all went wrong immediately after the independence of South Sudan, what was that moment? Because from the outside looking in, it seemed as if it unraveled very quickly.
This was something the South Sudanese were really looking forward to. They fought for 50 years to be free and have their emancipation and set up their country. But yes, looking back now, it looked that it took a while before the problem started. But it was really, it was 2011 we became independent, 2013, just before the second anniversary, South Sudan was already embroiled into war. It was triggered by power struggle right at the top. Mm-hmm. Although people knew that there were pending issues, from the period of struggle, there were cracks among the South Sudanese leadership at the time, but they were able to contain the cracks, the divisions, and the differences until independence. And people thought that they would be able to, manage those differences. Unfortunately, they didn't, and the country exploded in December 2013 into vicious violence. So that was really the moment, the month of November, October, November, leading up to December 2013. That was the period when it all built up and, the country descended into war.
Looking at this latest Amnesty report, in some ways, people would expect rebel forces that are not under kind of central control, many are just kind of random militias. Many people would expect them to be committing atrocities, but people wouldn't expect government soldiers to be killing civilians, to be raping women. So what does that tell you? Does that tell you that, for example, rape is being used as a weapon of war by the army, or that President Salva Kiir just has little control over his government and his country anymore? Which one is it?
Yes, more the latter than the former. He has command, but the command is limited. We must remember that South Sudan has had a very little time to build any significant infrastructure or institutions, really. The main institution that South Sudan has, really, is the army. Because this army was an army of volunteers who joined the revolution almost now in 1983 to fight for ultimately to fight for the right of South Sudan that led to independence. So that group of volunteers made up the core of the SPLM, which is the Sudan People's Liberation Army, the National Army of South Sudan. And it has really multiple tiers. If you go right to the core and the top of it, it's quite disciplined and organized, but really it's too big. And one of the major aims of the government at the initial periods of independence was to reorganize the army. And of course, the war came too soon, and that never actually came to fruition. So yes, there are huge issues of discipline in the army, but that is also made worse by the fact that the government has made use of allied militias, sort of loosely organized armies, group of armies, militias that are not really disciplined at all, not completely, don't come directly under the umbrella of the government, but they are allied to the government. And most atrocities have been coming from these groups. Mm-hmm.
So do you believe that everybody is currently committing war crimes right now?
Yes, the government will be culpable, will be responsible by default, because they are the ones ruling the country. They are the one commanding the army.
Yeah.
From their point of view, they're saying they're trying their very best. They're trying their best to control the army, but of course, ultimately, the responsibility is theirs. Yeah, but there isn't a design plan by the government to commit these things.
Yeah, for the moment, their best is not good enough.
Not strong enough.
I want to draw your attention to something President Salva Kiir said very recently, and then I want to get your comment off the back of it. Let's have a little listen for a moment.
I declared a unilateral ceasefire and general amnesty. I'm encouraged that the general security situation in the country has now improved. The ambushes and skirmishes that were daily occurrences have substantially diminished.
So he was talking about the declaration of the unilateral ceasefire, and he said the situation was generally stable. That's when I guess he felt he had the complete momentum over Riek Machar and any other rebels. Was he wrong? Was he naive to declare that unilateral ceasefire, given that the humanitarian crisis only seems to be getting worse and the fighting continues?
To be fair to the government, the statements of the president are right. I mean, he gave those statements barely a week ago in his speech for independence, and that's true. The violence has significantly subsided, but there isn't much to celebrate, because, as you say, a third of the country are living away from their homes. They are displaced either internally, living inside United Nations, refugee camps, and many of them, more than half of them, as well, living abroad, both in Sudan and other neighboring countries, Uganda and Kenya. And that is nothing to be proud of. Yes, in terms of the direct threat, army threat, military threat to the government, that has subsided. But the country has shrunk, the economy has shrunk significantly in the last few years. Maybe the economy has shrunk by 30–35% of what it was in 2011. That is a severe problem, and it's being felt by people that we know in the country. So there are huge issues. But yes, the violence, the direct violence, has subsided, and the government has had an upper hand.
Yeah.
Marwan,
the Secretary of State, the U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, has a plan to merge all or parts of the U.S. Agency for International Development into the State Department. There's talk of cuts to USAID and to the general aid to Africa as a whole, but South Sudan in particular. Now, the U.S. was big on South Sudanese independence. We saw it with President Barack Obama. We even saw it preceding him with President George W. Bush. The U.S. was a major funder and supporter of the South Sudanese independence movement. And then when you became a new country, they supported you and backed you. How devastating would it be if the U.S. decides not to give the little bit that it is giving right now?
Well, hugely devastating. Hugely devastating. But South Sudan was recognized as a middle-income country. In fact, if South Sudan did not have a potential to survive economically, maybe the international community might not have recognized it as an independent country. So that's a crucial issue. But that mainly is dependence on oil, and oil prices, to say the least, are way below what they used to be. And that's partly one of the problems in South Sudan. So it is going to hit South Sudan. But there are people in South Sudan, commentators, thinkers, people of opinion in South Sudan who would say this might actually be a good thing, because the history of aid in South Sudan in the last 50 years, especially the years of the war, where the South Sudanese subsistence farmers were, continued to be displaced and were incapable of producing enough food in the traditional manner, that period has created an environment of dependency. And maybe if aid is squeezed a little bit, that might actually nudge the South Sudanese communities to become self-reliant.
Understandable. That's long term, right? Sure, certainly. Sorry to interrupt you, but okay, that's long term.
Correct.
Right? You want people to be self-sufficient.
Yes.
But at the moment, 6 million people
Yes.
of your country are reliant on food aid. There's famine, there's cholera. Are you really telling me that it might be a silver lining that international aid might not be coming in? People are starving to death.
We know that the change of administration in America brought this, and it's not only South Sudan that's going to be affected by this. America is realigning its foreign policy. So it's going to devastate South Sudan. But also another thing in the immediate term, one thing that could come out of this is at the moment the South Sudanese are looking at a homegrown solution. And they are talking about perhaps the government is having this initiative, what they call the national dialogue. And maybe when people look behind them and see that, aid money is not going to become, their pockets are not going to be lined, they're not going to be taken to expensive hotels around the world to negotiate, that might actually nudge the leaders to maybe seek solutions.
That's
and if there are political
Yep.
solutions, that would force them to address the issues.
Yeah, fair point, fair point. Marwan Murtad, it's been good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us.